Hello, everyone. Welcome to my VB localhost 2021 presentation titled When Malware Changed Its Mind, an empirical study of variable program behaviors in the real world. My name is Erin Avllazagaj, and this work has been done with my collaborators, Leyla, Bilge, Davide, Balzarotti, and my advisor, Tudor, Dumitras. Again, my name is Erin Avllazagaj. I'm a PhD student at the University of Maryland, College Park, and my research is mainly focused on data-driven analysis of malware in the wild. So the agenda for today is as follows. We're gonna talk about the drawbacks of using dynamic analysis. We're gonna measure the malware variability in the real world, and we're gonna find invariants, and we'll present some actionable implications about how to find them. And last, we're also going to talk about how the malware in the wild compares against current dynamical analysis techniques and the lessons we learn from those. So it's well known that malware behavior changes across environments. In fact, prior work has shown that malware changes due to different reasons. For example, missing libraries, different language settings, etc. And there's also been some other work that has advised to be more cautious when generalizing results that are taken from using a single OS version. And let's take an example, the Ramnit worm. And in this case, if you look at the code on the right, which was very well reverse engineered by cert.pl, we can see that the malware is trying to perform in line 22 an exploit. And this is a local privilege exploit, which can also be detected by looking into the hundreds of mutex creations that will happen. However, they will only happen if the malware is being run on a Windows 7, vulnerable version of Windows 7, and in non-admin privileges. So it will have to pass the first if statement and fail the second and third. So the research questions are as follows. First, we are trying to measure the variability. We want to be able to see what parts of the malware behavior changes in an execution trace and by how much. So for example, in the previous case, we'd want to see if in fact the mutex creations is the one that changes more in the Ramnit worm. Then we also want to find behavioral invariance across multiple executions, and we'll try to see what is the appropriate way of doing it. And last, we also want to measure the impact of variability in malware's behavior in existing malware detection or malware clustering tools. However, answering these questions requires data from many machines in the wild because sandbox observations may not be able to capture all the user interactions or all the environments in the wild. Therefore, in 2018, we collected 7.6 million execution traces of malware POP or benign in 5.4 million real users machines across more than 100 countries in the world. As with other real user data, the privacy is at utmost importance. So in our dataset, we do not collect any identifiable information. Additionally, we don't put the user at risk by having them run the malware, but we only record passively as a last line of defense to detect the more stealthy malware. Therefore, we believe that our dataset captures the real threat landscape in the wild. Technically, our dataset looks like a big table with rows corresponding to events or actions, and the columns containing all the metadata and also parameters for those actions. And one thing we did in the beginning of our analysis is that we split the data into hashes. So we'd have one different table for each hash. And then to determine whether this hash is malware or benign, we look back into VirusTotal and we expect that the malware will be detected at least 1 year later. So we used the virus total label from 2019 to classify our executions, and we found out that there is 22,000 benigns, 2.4K malware, and 1,600 POPs. Again, to motivate our analysis of variability across machines, we take a look back at the remnant sample. As we saw earlier, in line 22, the malware will try to create multiple mutexes, in fact, hundreds of mutexes, to exploit a certain vulnerable version of Windows. However, this is only going to happen in some of the machines, because in some others, maybe the malware is already running in admin privileges, or the version is no longer vulnerable. Therefore, to perform such an analysis, we need to split our data for, instead of only for each hash, now we also need to split it for each machine. So then we can have a table that has a group of all the executions of that sample in that machine. Then what we do is as follows. For all the machines, we simply perform a count of how many file creations there are, how many mutex creations, etc. And then for the purpose of this presentation, we'll only consider the total number of events. Then we simply put all of these numbers for all of the machines that this malware sample has run on into a big array, and we simply calculate the IQR, which is basically the 75th percentile minus the 25th percentile. And the IQR is used because we also have some cases where the malware is performing too many file creations in one single machines, or it is doing almost nothing in some other machines. So to get rid of these extreme cases, we chose to use the IQR. And for the rest of the action types, we have our analysis in the paper. And then once we collect the IQRs, we create a box plot of IQRs for all of the malware, POP, and benign samples. So for example, if we take a look back at our remnant sample, here we have a Splunk dashboard where we analyze two different traces of the sample when it's being run on a Windows 7 and Windows 10. So on the left side, we have the trace that executed on a Windows 7, and you can see that the most dominant action is a mutex creation. And in the right side is a normal execution that would happen in a Windows 10 machine, or maybe in the case where the malware is running in admin privileges. And in between, you can see the green bars. Then the mutex creation has a value of more than 50, which means that if we have a considerable number of cases where the remnant has been executed on user mode and vulnerable version, we would have a lot of mutex creation. And if we also have a considerable number of cases where the exploit didn't happen, then we would have cases, as you can see in the trace 2. Then the green bars would be the IQR variability. And here we show our results for malware, POP, and benign across all the number of actions in an execution trace. And we see that for at least 50% of the malware samples, there are 59 missing or additional actions happening across machines. And this number is considerably higher than the POPs and benign. And we then investigate further and we try to see which action type is actually more variable in malware than in the other ones. And we found out that file creation is the most variable. So most of the variability that you see in the figure above is actually coming from file creations. But then we also look more into details on what exactly varies in those file creations. So the methodology is pretty simple. So we have a count for the number of unique file names or file paths or file extensions that happens for each machine. And we found out that the number of unique file names changes a lot across multiple machines for malware samples. So for at least 50% of the samples, there is 25 more or less file names appearing across machines. But this, in fact, is not the only indicator, so it doesn't really show much what is happening. So if there is any file name that remains the same across machines, this metric doesn't show it to us. So the next thing we do is that we measure the Jacquard index. And this one would show that whether there is a value shared across machines, that the Jacquard index would be non-zero at least. But we found out that for more than 99% of the malware samples, this is not the case. So there is only very few samples in which the file name remains the same across all machines. So let's take, for example, the good table. And this case, we found out that there is a 0 value for Jacquard index and 0.2 for mutex names. And we also found that it had an IQR of 0 for file creations and a 2 for the mutex creations. So it actually tells us that the mutexes are a better candidate for building signatures because we can see that there is an overlap of 0.2. And in fact, from what we saw from a trend micro report, this is actually what's happening. So the mutex creation has that random value, the age 48, appearing in all machines. However, the zone cache counter mutex and zone attribute cache counter mutex only appeared in half of the machines, which explains the IQR of 2, which means that in the half of the machines, there are 2 mutexes that are missing. And this is, as I said, confirmed by a trend micro report that you can see the link below. So as a summary, we showed that there is a high variability in malware across machines, and file creation makes up for most of the variability in malware, and the file name is the most variable parameter. For most malware, there is also no single parameter value that is shared across machines, except for the file extension. So with what we saw so far, we seem to have lost hope of detecting the malware. But in fact, we only looked at using the full parameter value. So we have not seen whether a part of the parameter value is enough to capture the malware. And this is what we're doing to answer the research question number 2. So in this case, we focus on action parameter pair signatures, something like what is used in Sigma or other SIEM rules. For example, if you can see on the right side, there is a Sigma rule that is created for process creations, and it tries to match whether a process creation with the following command line that matches that regular expression is happening. And if so, it may be something suspicious. And it's also, the same thing is also used in Cuckoo to detect some suspicious activity. For example, to determine whether the malware is establishing persistence, there might be certain regular expressions on file creation events. However, all of these regular expressions rely on some very simple tokens. So for example, users, app data, documents, settings, etc., as we show in the green boxes. Therefore, it's in our best interest to only focus on these tokens, because if these tokens don't match, then the whole rule will fail to match. But to motivate the analysis of these tokens, we have a look back at the largest database of CM rules in the world, Sigma. And in Sigma, we're trying to see how many of those rules have at least one token in them. And to find out if the rule has a token, we first look into the rules that have no regular expression at all and see if those can be tokenized, meaning that there is one token for those rules. And if the rules have a regular expression, which in this case is most of them, we have a look at those cases in which we have three tokens, at least three tokens between two regular expression characters, which means that if there is a case where the leftmost token has a star and the rightmost token has a star, the token in the middle should match, which is indicator that if we're studying these tokens, then those tokens should match for these rules to match. So we found out that around 70% of all the Sigma open source rules have at least one full token. For the other 30%, we found that they were like half a token and maybe a star, or maybe 2 stars and half a token. So the invariant analysis we perform is as follows. We take all the malware samples and all the benign samples, and we look into their parameters. So we strip those parameters based on the tokens as we show in the red. And then after we split them by delimiters, we remove all the values in the malware samples that appear in any of the benign samples. And this is done because we are only interested in malware specific tokens. So we want to remove tokens that are like CSIDL profile, or like a setup.exe or something.png. So the .png part is not really an indicator of the malicious activity. So once we remove those, we are left with, let's say, WNRY, which is a WannaCry extension, and something like virus. And then we measure in how many of the machines we see that to appear. So for example, as an hypothetical example, one token appears in 60% of the machines, the other one appears in 20%. And in our interest, if we are the analyst, we'll want to deploy two rules, one for the first token and one for the second. So then what we measure is a combination of those, and how would that rule, or maybe a regular expression of those tokens, appear in the wild. And so to better be able to replicate this process, we came up with the following methodology. First, we perform a random sampling of n machines, and then we measure the amount of malware tokens that we find in those n machines, and then we compare this with all the samples malware tokens that we have in our data set. So the idea of this experiment is to find out how many machines do we need to capture all the tokens. And we do this for different parameter types, such as file name, file path, command line, etc. And the results are shown in the figure below. As we see, the file names are the most difficult to completely capture. Meanwhile, the command line tokens and the subdirectories are captured with about 10 machines. So how do we use these tokens to detect? And how do we maximize the coverage of those tokens? So the assumption in this other experiment is that the sandbox is undetectable. Therefore, whatever we see in the wild, the analyst would be able to capture in their sandbox, just like in a real machine. So we pick n machines to get the bag of tokens, and then we check how much coverage we'd get with all the tokens, with an OR value of all the tokens. And so we get the following results. As we show in the figure below, that you get a maximum coverage if you are using at least 3 machines for the file name. And then if you're using more machines, then you would get the diminishing returns. So how do we interpret this is that if you can see the green box plot will show the amount of coverage that you'll get from all the tokens that you extract from 3 machines. So this means that we get at least 87% coverage for all the malware samples in the wild if we are using 3 machines. And if we're using more, you'd get more coverage, but it wouldn't be worth to invest more. But that was only for file name. So we also do the same thing for the file path and the command line, since those were the other 2 most popular sources of signatures in Sigma. And as we show from figure B and C, the analyst needs 7 machines to collect enough tokens to get a high coverage for the file path. And they need 4 machines to collect enough tokens for the command line. Therefore, what we conclude from these results is that while it's easier to obtain command line and file path signatures or tokens, it's more difficult to get coverage for those. But how would an analyst create 3 or 4 different sandboxes? And what we think it would be possible is to use a random VM generator like SecGen with the features proposed by prior work. So as you can see from table 1, there are multiple features that different users' machines in the wild would have, and we could create some sandboxes that have various values for different features. And AV vendors can collect such features with minimum overhead. Lastly, we take a look at the impact of malware behavior variability in existing techniques such as malware clustering or anomaly detection, such as access miner or SIEM systems, etc. So first, we tackle the clustering. The question we want to answer is as follows. How does the malware behavior variability affect clustering? And for this, we follow the following methodology. We get 4 executions per malware sample in the same week, such that we can get rid of time variability. And then we use one of the clustering techniques from prior work as proposed by Bailey et al., because they had the same features as us. And so we use 4 executions. And the idea is that all those 4 executions should fall into the same clusters. And what we find out is that for 67% of the malware, the 4 executions fall into the same cluster. However, for the rest of the malware, there is 27% of them that have executions fall into 2 different clusters, and 5% of them have execution fall into 3 different clusters, and 1% have all the executions fall into all 4 different clusters. And therefore, we conclude that clustering results with 1 trace per sample may not correctly cluster malware into families. So an analyst needs to be careful when using one execution per malware. And next, we look into anomaly detector. And the questions we want to answer are as follows. Is 1 execution per benign sample enough to generalize. And second is, what is the success rate for catching malware and POP in the wild? And basically, the intuition is that we want to be able to capture most of the benign executions. So basically, the methodology for anomaly detection experiment is as follows. We first implement a very well-known technique known as the access miner. And then in this case, we select 90% of the benign samples to extract all the file write directories. And then once you extract the file write directories, you create a tree of well-known behavior. And the next step is to test it on other benign and malware samples to see whether they fit into this well-known benign behavior. And if they do not, they would raise an alarm, as for access miner. So we start off with one random benign execution, and we construct this benign behavior tree, and we found out that we get a very high detection rate for malware. However, at the same time, we also get a very high false positive rate. So if you can see from the picture below, a 1.0 detection means that for about 70% of the malware samples, we could detect them in all machines. And 0.9 means that we would miss them in 10% of the machines, and so on. Then we use all the benign executions, and we can see that the false positive rate drops significantly. However, there are also more than 10% of the benign samples that we still detect in all machines as if they were malware samples. And however, this also shows that the malware detection rate is low because now you can only detect up to 43 or 44% of the malware samples in all machines. Therefore, as a summary, we conclude the following. When employing a malware analysis method such as clustering or detection, the analyst needs to be careful, and the analyst needs to use more than one execution for a malware sample and also more than one execution for the benign samples, such that they can generalize the benign and malicious behavior and be able to really capture what's happening in the wild. So to conclude the talk, our work presents the first measurement of malware behavior at scale, and we show that a single trace per malware sample is not enough. Next, we also measured the variability, and we showed that the variability in malware is greater than POP and benign across both time and machines. And we referred to our timing variability results from the paper. Last, we say that it is still feasible to find an invariant in malware behavior, and we showed that AV vendors can safely do it. And thank you again for attending my talk. My name is Erin Avllazagaj, and you can ask me questions in my email below.